Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The problem of universals. Why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats. And this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal. And the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable, neither provides an obvious easy answer. And the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is red by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties, all struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms. And the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly. And this explains how we can think about perfect circles, even though no physical object is perfectly circular. We grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems. How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other, and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties. And redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are red by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply. And so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete, unrepeatable particulars, and the universals wait, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters, and despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The philosophical zombie argument, why consciousness might not come from physics. A creature walks among us that looks exactly like a human being, molecule for molecule identical, atom for atom the same, every neuron firing in the same patterns, every behavior perfectly matched. And this creature speaks as we speak, acts as we act, responds to pain by withdrawing, to beauty by smiling, to loss by crying. And yet inside there is nothing. No subjective experience, no consciousness, no inner light, no feeling of what it is like to be this creature. And this being is called a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, a thought experiment in philosophy of mind that challenges physicalism, challenges the view that consciousness is nothing more than physical processes, and the zombie argument asks us to imagine such creatures, to consider whether they are conceivable. And if they are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. And if they are possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical processes, cannot be reduced to brain states, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And this shows that consciousness is something extra, something additional to the physical. And this is the philosophical zombie argument, deployed by David Chalmers and others to defend property dualism, to argue that subjective experience is not reducible to objective physical facts. And the argument remains one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Imagine encountering a zombie, engaging in conversation, watching it navigate the world, and nothing in its behavior betrays the absence of consciousness. It claims to be conscious, describes its experiences in first-person terms, acts exactly as a conscious being would act, and the only difference, the only divergence between zombie and human is the inner life, the presence or absence of subjective experience, and the zombie has none, is dark inside, operates purely through physical mechanisms without any accompanying phenomenology. And the argument asks whether such a being is conceivable, whether we can coherently imagine it, and if we can, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, is not entailed by brain processes, and physicalism fails, and some form of dualism must be true. The argument can be stated formally as follows: it is conceivable that there be zombies, creatures physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not identical to physical processes. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to physical processes. And this conclusion challenges materialism, challenges the view that everything is physical, that mental states are brain states, and forces recognition of an explanatory gap, a gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts that cannot be bridged by physical explanation alone. Visualize two worlds. One is our world, filled with conscious beings who have inner lives, who experience redness and pain and joy, and the other is zombie world, physically identical. Every particle in the same position, every force acting identically, but lacking consciousness. All beings are zombies, and the question is whether zombie world is possible, whether it is a coherent scenario. And Chalmers argues that it is, that we can conceive of such a world without contradiction, and this conceivability establishes possibility, and possibility refutes physicalism, shows that physical facts do not exhaust all facts, that there are phenomenal facts that are additional to physical facts. Physicalists respond to the zombie argument in multiple ways. The most direct response denies that zombies are conceivable, argues that the apparent conceivability is illusory, that we think we can imagine zombies because we are not thinking carefully enough, not considering all the implications, and that when we try to fill in the details, try to specify exactly how a zombie would work, contradictions emerge, and zombies turn out to be impossible after all. And this response requires showing that consciousness is entailed by physical structure, that given the right physical organization, consciousness must arise. And this is the hard part, explaining why and how physical processes necessitate consciousness. Another response accepts that zombies are conceivable, but denies that conceivability implies possibility, argues that there is a gap between what we can imagine and what is actually possible, that conceivability is an epistemic notion about what seems possible to us, while possibility is a metaphysical notion about what could actually be. And these can come apart. We can conceive of things that are actually impossible, like water being something other than H2O. And Kripke's work on necessity and identity supports this, shows that identities, like water is H2O, are necessary, even though we can conceive of their negation. And the same applies to consciousness, is brain process. It might be necessarily true, even though we can conceive of its negation. And so zombies, while conceivable, are not possible, and the zombie argument fails. A third response argues that the zombie argument begs the question, assumes what it sets out to prove, because the claim that zombies are conceivable assumes that consciousness is something separable from physical processes, something that could be absent while physical processes remain. And this assumption is precisely what physicalists deny. And so the argument does not refute physicalism, but merely asserts an alternative view. And physicalists are not obliged to accept the zombie scenario as genuinely conceivable, can reject it as incoherent or question-begging. The zombie argument connects to other arguments about consciousness, to the knowledge argument about Mary, and to the explanatory gap, and to the hard problem of consciousness, all pointing to the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in physical terms, all suggesting that phenomenal consciousness resists reduction. And these arguments collectively create a case for dualism, for the view that consciousness is not physical, though the case remains controversial, remains rejected by many philosophers who maintain that consciousness will eventually be explained physically, that the apparent gap is due to ignorance, not to genuine irreducibility. The zombie walks through the world, behaving normally, seeming conscious, and yet the question hangs: is there anyone home? Is there subjective experience? Or is the creature an automaton, a sophisticated mechanism that mimics consciousness without having it? And the zombie argument uses this thought experiment to probe the nature of consciousness, to test whether consciousness can be separated from physical structure. And the answer determines whether physicalism is true, whether everything about consciousness can be explained in physical terms, or whether consciousness is something more, something that transcends the physical. And the zombie remains, conceivable or not, possible or not, a thought experiment that continues to challenge materialist theories of mind, continues to force physicalists to explain how consciousness arises from matter, how subjective experience emerges from objective processes, and the philosophical zombie endures as one of the most vivid and controversial thought experiments in philosophy. A creature that may be impossible, but whose mere conceivability threatens physicalism, whose imagined existence reveals the explanatory gap between brain and mind, between matter and consciousness, and whether zombies could exist remains disputed, remains a test case for theories of consciousness. And the zombie argument persists as a central challenge to the view that science can explain everything, that physical facts exhaust all facts, and that consciousness is nothing more than brain processes arranged in certain ways. The Preface Paradox. An author completes a lengthy scholarly work, a book synthesizing years of research, containing hundreds of individual claims about history, science, or philosophy, and the author has carefully checked each claim, believes each one to be true, based on the available evidence, and yet in the preface, the author writes something like this: "Despite my best efforts, I am certain that this book contains errors, that some of the claims I have made are false, and I apologize in advance for any mistakes that careful readers may discover." This acknowledgement is standard, even expected in academic writing, a gesture of intellectual humility, an admission that no human work is perfect. That error is inevitable in any sufficiently complex undertaking, and yet this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book believes that claim 1 is true, that claim 2 is true, that claim 3 is true, and so on for all the claims, and belief is usually thought to be closed under conjunction, meaning that if you believe each of several propositions, then you should believe their conjunction. And so the author should believe that all the claims in the book are true, and yet the author also believes that at least one of the claims is false, that not all of them are true, and these two beliefs are contradictory. And so the author holds contradictory beliefs, and this seems irrational. Yet the author's behaviour seems entirely reasonable. Both the individual beliefs and the belief that some of them are false seem justified. And so the preface paradox reveals a tension between rationality and consistency, between what it is reasonable to believe and what logic says about the relationships between beliefs. The paradox was first articulated clearly by David Mackinson in 1965, though related issues had been discussed earlier, and it challenges the principle that rational belief is closed under conjunction, that if you rationally believe P and rationally believe Q, then you must rationally believe P and Q, because in the preface case, the author rationally believes each claim individually, but rationally believes that their conjunction is false, or at least that the conjunction is likely to contain errors. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that it is possible to rationally believe many individual propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the number of propositions is large and the probability that each is true, while high, is less than certainty. Because if each claim has a 99% chance of being true, then a book with 100 claims has only about 37% chance of having all its claims be true, and so it is perfectly rational to believe each claim while doubting that all are true. Another response is to distinguish between degrees of belief, arguing that the author assigns high credence to each individual claim, perhaps 99%, but assigns lower credence to the conjunction of all the claims, and that there is no contradiction here, only a recognition that confidence decreases as the number of independent claims increases. And this response draws on probabilistic or Bayesian approaches to rational belief, where belief comes in degrees rather than being all or nothing, and where the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts, if they are independent, and so the probability that all claims are true can be much lower than the probability that any particular claim is true. A third response is to argue that the author's belief in the preface, the belief that the book contains errors, is of a different kind than the beliefs in the individual claims, that it is a higher order belief about the author's own fallibility rather than a first order belief about the subject matter of the book, and that there is no direct contradiction between believing that you are generally fallible and believing specific claims, just as there is no contradiction in a weather forecaster believing that their forecasts are occasionally wrong while believing that today's forecast is correct. The preface paradox connects to broader issues in epistemology about the nature of rational belief, the role of evidence, the significance of consistency, and whether it is possible for a rational agent to knowingly hold inconsistent beliefs. And while inconsistency is generally considered a mark of irrationality, the preface paradox suggests that there are cases where inconsistency, or at least apparent inconsistency, is unavoidable, and perhaps even required by rationality, because to refuse to acknowledge the possibility of error when error is statistically almost certain would itself be a form of irrationality, a failure to properly calibrate beliefs to the evidence. The paradox also relates to the lottery paradox, another puzzle about rational belief and probability, where you rationally believe of each ticket in a large fair lottery that it will not win, but you also rationally believe that some ticket will win, and again rational belief seems to violate closure under conjunction, and together these paradoxes suggest that the classical logical picture of belief, where beliefs are consistent sets of propositions closed under logical consequence, may not accurately capture how rational agents actually form and maintain beliefs in conditions of uncertainty. The preface paradox has practical implications for how we think about knowledge and expertise, because it suggests that experts, even while justifiably confident in their individual judgments, should maintain an overall humility about the possibility of error. And this humility is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but a recognition of the statistical reality of human fallibility. And it supports practices like peer review, replication, and open debate, all of which are mechanisms for catching errors that individual researchers, despite their care and expertise, are likely to make. The paradox also raises questions about the ethics of assertion and testimony, about what it is permissible to assert or to claim as knowledge. Because if the author knows that the book contains errors, in the sense of being confident that at least one claim is false, then is it honest to present the book as if all the claims are true, or should every claim be hedged with qualifications and caveats? And if so, would this not make communication impossibly cumbersome? And yet, if we present claims without hedges, do we mislead our audience? Do we pretend to a certainty we do not possess? And these questions have no easy answers, and different contexts may call for different standards of assertion, with scientific writing allowing for the acknowledgement of fallibility in a way that courtroom testimony or medical diagnosis may not. The author sits with the completed manuscript, proud of the work yet aware of its limitations, believing each sentence yet doubting the whole, and this dual attitude, far from being irrational, seems to be the mark of a careful and honest thinker, someone who takes seriously both the evidence for individual claims and the statistical likelihood of error. And the preface paradox forces recognition that rationality is more complex than simple consistency, that the principles governing rational belief must accommodate uncertainty, fallibility, and the limits of human cognition, and that sometimes the rational response to evidence is to hold beliefs that are, in a technical sense, inconsistent. And this inconsistency is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of how finite minds navigate an uncertain world. And the paradox remains a puzzle that challenges our theories of rational belief, that resists easy resolution, and that reminds us that even the attempt to be perfectly rational, perfectly consistent, perfectly certain, is itself a kind of error, a failure to recognize that error is inevitable, that certainty is elusive, and that the best we can do is to believe what the evidence supports, while acknowledging that some of what we believe must, almost certainly, be false. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows. The solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water, but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid. And after drying, this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms, because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms. And so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. And since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships, and while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care. And students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98. A change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioral. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behavior to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential, is based on analogy to our own case. And this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behavior without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behavior, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behavior is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behavior and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological gap, a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behavior to unobserved mental states. And such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behavior. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviors. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. And I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviors. And by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behavior, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. But critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of 1, On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases, is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behavior remains the same, but is manifested in behavior, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behavior and mind, no possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behavior, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious, because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behavior of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behavior, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behavior, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding. And our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioral. We see animals exhibit pain behavior, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us, and the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie, that there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle, but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge. the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference, and the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behaviour and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage, the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others, but it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility, and these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance for all its virtues is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The 5 phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not 2 separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the 5 phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the 5 phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. An understanding fee reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation, a perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the 5 phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes, then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved, no object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The phi phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition. And phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output. And phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity, and the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences, and the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction, and phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The prisoner's dilemma. Why rational people choose worse outcomes. Two criminals are arrested, held in separate cells, cannot communicate, and the prosecutor offers each the same deal. Testify against your partner and you go free while your partner gets 10 years, or stay silent, and if your partner also stays silent, you both get 1 year for a lesser charge. But if you stay silent and your partner testifies, then you get 10 years and your partner goes free. And if you both testify, you both get 5 years, and each prisoner must decide independently, without knowing what the other will choose. And the rational analysis is straightforward. From each prisoner's perspective, testifying dominates staying silent. If your partner stays silent, you get freedom by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. And if your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 years by staying silent. So regardless of what your partner does, you're better off testifying. And since both prisoners reason this way, both testify, both get 5 years, and yet if both had stayed silent, both would have gotten only 1 year. And so rational individual decision-making produces a collectively worse outcome. And this is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important concepts in game theory, a demonstration that individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality, that pursuing self-interest can harm everyone, including yourself. And the dilemma has applications across economics, politics, environmental policy, international relations, and reveals fundamental tensions between individual and collective good, between rationality and cooperation. Imagine being one of the prisoners, sitting in the cell, considering your options, and you reason, if I stay silent, I get either 1 year if my partner stays silent, or 10 years if my partner testifies. And if I testify, I get either freedom if my partner stays silent, or 5 years if my partner testifies. And comparing these, testifying is better in both cases, gives me a better outcome regardless of what my partner does. And this is a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best no matter what others do. And rationality seems to require choosing your dominant strategy. And so you testify, and your partner reasons the same way, also testifies, and you both get 5 years. And looking back, you realize that if you had both stayed silent, you would both be better off. Would both get only 1 year? but you had no way to ensure your partner would stay silent, no way to trust. And without trust, the rational choice is to testify, even though cooperation would benefit both. The prisoner's dilemma demonstrates the difference between Nash equilibrium, a state where no player can improve by changing strategy unilaterally, and Pareto optimality, a state where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. And in the dilemma, both testifying is a Nash equilibrium because neither prisoner can improve by switching to silence if the other is testifying. But both testifying is not Pareto optimal because both could be better off if both stayed silent. And this divergence between equilibrium and optimality is what creates the dilemma, shows that rational individual decision-making can get stuck in suboptimal outcomes, can fail to reach mutually beneficial cooperation. Visualize the dilemma as a payoff matrix. Rows represent prisoner A's choices, columns represent prisoner B's choices, and the cells show the outcomes. And the structure reveals that mutual cooperation yields better outcomes than mutual defection. But cooperation is risky, is vulnerable to exploitation, and defection is safe. Is the rational choice if you cannot trust your partner. And the dilemma captures this tension between cooperation and defection, between trusting others and protecting yourself. And this tension is ubiquitous, appears in countless real-world situations, from arms races to environmental agreements to business competition. The prisoner's dilemma has multiple variants. Iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the same players interact repeatedly. An iteration changes the analysis because future interactions create incentives for cooperation, create opportunities for reputation building and retaliation, and strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate initially and then mirror your partner's previous choice, perform well in iterated games, achieve cooperation through reciprocity. And this shows that repeated interaction can solve the dilemma, can enable cooperation even among self-interested rational agents. And real-world interactions are often repeated, are embedded in ongoing relationships, and this repetition facilitates cooperation, makes trust possible. Another variant is the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, also called the tragedy of the commons, where many individuals face the choice between cooperating, restraining themselves for collective benefit, or defecting, pursuing individual benefit at collective cost. And examples include overfishing, pollution, climate change, where each individual's rational self-interest leads to collective disaster. And the tragedy of the commons shows that the prisoner's dilemma scales applies to large groups. And the problem is even harder with many players because coordination is more difficult, free riding is easier, and collective action problems arise, and solving these requires institutions, requires mechanisms for enforcement, for monitoring, for punishing defectors. And this is why societies have laws, have regulations, have enforcement mechanisms, because voluntary cooperation is difficult to sustain in large groups facing prisoners' dilemmas. The dilemma also has implications for moral philosophy, for understanding ethics and rationality, because the dilemma shows that rationality and morality can conflict, that the rational choice is to defect, to pursue self-interest, but the moral choice is to cooperate, to consider collective welfare. And this conflict challenges theories that equate rationality with morality, shows that purely self-interested rationality is insufficient for social welfare, requires supplementation with moral considerations, with concern for others, and various moral theories respond differently. Consequentialism might argue that the rational thing is to cooperate because outcomes matter. Contractarianism might argue that rational agents would agree to constraints on defection to avoid mutual harm, and virtue ethics might argue that cooperating reflects good character, even if not strictly rational, in narrow self-interest. One lesson from the prisoner's dilemma is the importance of institutions, of mechanisms that change incentives, that make cooperation rational, and laws that punish defection. Contracts that bind parties, monitoring systems that detect cheating, all serve to solve prisoners' dilemmas. All transform situations where defection is rational into situations where cooperation is rational. And understanding the dilemma helps design better institutions, helps create systems where individual incentives align with collective good. And much of economics and political science concerns this problem, concerns how to structure institutions to promote cooperation in dilemma-like situations. Another lesson is the importance of communication, of trust building, of reputation, because in real-world dilemmas, players can communicate, can make commitments, can observe each other's behavior over time, and these factors facilitate cooperation, make it easier to coordinate on the cooperative outcome. And experiments show that allowing communication increases cooperation rates dramatically in prisoners' dilemmas. And this is why diplomacy matters, why negotiation matters, why building relationships matters, because these processes enable cooperation even when individual incentives favour defection. The prisoners sit in separate cells, cannot communicate, face the choice, and rational analysis drives them both to testify, to defect, even though cooperation would benefit both. And the dilemma reveals that rationality is not enough, that collective outcomes require more than individual optimization, require cooperation, trust, institutions, repeated interaction, communication, and the prisoner's dilemma remains one of the most important concepts in social science, a simple game that captures fundamental tensions in social life, that shows why cooperation is difficult, why self-interest can be self-defeating, why rational agents can fail to achieve optimal outcomes, and the dilemma persists as a permanent challenge to theories of rationality, to assumptions about markets and institutions, and as a tool for understanding why societies need laws, norms, enforcement, reputation, communication, all mechanisms that help solve dilemmas, that enable cooperation despite individual incentives to defect. And the prisoners testify, and both lose more than they needed to, and the dilemma endures. The problem of the one, why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person, rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship, rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. and the answer seems to require something additional. A principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible, and Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations, and the whole is not an additional entity but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples, faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons, because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems. And what unifies a person? What makes a collection of cells? One person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis, or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate, and the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The private language argument, why you cannot invent words only you understand. A person decides to create a private language, a language for describing inner sensations that only the person can experience, and the person picks a letter, say S, and decides that S will refer to a particular sensation, a specific feeling that recurs occasionally, and whenever the sensation occurs, the person writes S in a diary, and the person is the only one who knows what S means, the only one who can identify the sensation because the sensation is private, is accessible only to the person who feels it. And this seems possible, seems like something anyone could do, seems like we already do this to some extent when we give names to our own private experiences, but Ludwig Wittgenstein argues in his philosophical investigations that such a private language is impossible, that the scenario described involves a fundamental confusion about how language works, about what it means for a word to have meaning. And this is the private language argument, one of the most discussed and controversial arguments in 20th century philosophy, a challenge to the idea that we can give meaning to words through private mental acts of association, through inner ostensive definition, and an argument that meaning requires public criteria, requires shared practices, requires more than individual intention or inner recognition. Imagine the person using S over time, writing it when the sensation occurs, and now the question arises, how does the person know they are using S correctly? How does the person know that today's sensation is the same as yesterday's sensation, that both deserve the label S, and the person consults memory, remembers what S means, remembers the sensation, and judges that yes, the current sensation matches, deserves the label S. But Wittgenstein asks what makes this judgment correct. What distinguishes correctly remembering what S means from merely seeming to remember correctly? And in a public language, there are external checks. Other speakers can correct mistakes, can point out when a word is misused. But in a private language, there is no external check, no way to distinguish genuine correctness from apparent correctness, no way to distinguish following a rule from merely thinking one is following a rule, and so the distinction collapses. And if there is no distinction between being right and seeming right, then there is no meaning, no rule, no language, only the illusion of language. The argument can be stated as a dilemma. Either the private language user has a criterion for correct use of S, something that determines when S applies and when it does not, or the user has no criterion, and if there is a criterion, then it must be something public, something that could, in principle, be recognized by others. Because private criteria are impossible, cannot distinguish correct from incorrect application, and so the language is not really private. And if there is no criterion, then S does not have a meaning, does not refer to anything determinate, is just a mark that the user writes arbitrarily. And either way, private language fails. Either it is not really private or it is not really language, and the conclusion is that language requires public criteria, requires embedding in shared practices, requires more than inner acts of association. Visualize the private language user checking whether to apply S, looking inward, consulting the memory of what S means, and judging that the current sensation matches. And Wittgenstein compares this to buying several copies of the same newspaper to check whether the first copy was telling the truth. The consultation of memory is not an independent check, not a genuine verification, because memory itself might be mistaken, and there is no way within the private framework to correct memory, no external standard against which to test it. And so the whole enterprise collapses into subjectivity, into whatever seems right is right. And this destroys meaning, makes S meaningless because there is no distinction between correct and incorrect use. The private language argument has profound implications for philosophy of mind, for theories of consciousness, for the question of whether mental states are purely private or whether they have public dimensions, and if private language is impossible, then purely private mental states are problematic, are not the kind of thing we can talk about or think about in determinate ways. And this suggests that even our inner lives, even our private experiences are shaped by public language, by shared concepts, by social practices. And there is no purely private realm of experience that exists independent of language and society. One response to the argument defends private language, argues that Wittgenstein's standards for meaning are too strict, that memory can serve as a criterion even if it is fallible, that we do have private access to our sensations, and that this access, combined with memory, is sufficient to ground meaning. And this response denies that meaning requires public criteria, argues that private ostensive definition is possible, that we can give names to our inner states through acts of attention and association. And while these names might be incorrigible, might admit of no external check, they are still meaningful, still refer determinately to experiences, and the private language argument fails to show otherwise. Another response accepts that individual private language is impossible, but argues that this does not threaten our understanding of consciousness or inner experience, because we do not actually use private language, we use public language to describe our inner states, and words like pain and sensation have public criteria, have behavioural and contextual conditions for application. And so there is no need for private language, no loss if private language is impossible, and the argument's conclusion, rather than being threatening, is liberating, shows that language is essentially social, that meaning is public, and that our inner lives are not sealed off, but are accessible through language and behaviour. A third response questions whether Wittgenstein's argument succeeds, argues that it proves too much, that if private language is impossible, then all language is impossible, because even public language requires individuals to remember meanings, to apply rules based on memory and judgment. And if memory is insufficient for private language, why is it sufficient for public language? And this response suggests that the private language argument creates a general skepticism about meaning that Wittgenstein himself would reject, that the argument needs to be refined to distinguish the legitimate role of memory in public language from the illegitimate role in private language, and making this distinction is difficult. The private language argument also connects to broader issues about rule following, about what it means to follow a rule, to do the same thing repeatedly, to continue a series, and Wittgenstein's point is that rule following is not a matter of inner interpretation, not a matter of grasping a meaning in the mind, but is a matter of practice, of training, of embedding in a community, and rules are constituted by practices rather than by mental states, and following a rule is doing what counts as correct within a practice, not doing what seems correct to an isolated individual. And this social account of rules shapes Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, of logic, of language, and underlies the private language argument. The person sits with the diary with entries of S scattered through the pages, and the question remains whether S means anything, whether the person is using language or merely making marks. And Wittgenstein's argument says that without public criteria, without shared practices, without the possibility of correction by others, S is meaningless. The diary is not a record but a pretense, and the private language is not language at all. And the argument persists as one of the most challenging and important arguments in philosophy, an argument that has shaped discussions of meaning, of mind, of consciousness, and of the relationship between language and reality. And whether the argument succeeds remains disputed, remains a matter of ongoing philosophical debate, but its influence is undeniable, has changed how philosophers think about private experience, about meaning, about the conditions that make language possible, and the private language argument endures as a permanent challenge to Cartesian conceptions of mind, to the idea of a purely private inner realm, and to theories that ground meaning in individual mental acts rather than in public practices. And the diary sits closed, the S entries unreadable, meaningful, or meaningless depending on whether Wittgenstein is right, and the argument remains powerful and controversial, a landmark in 20th century philosophy. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers, and those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession, and in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before because their incomes have fallen, and so the collective attempt to increase savings fails. Defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behavior that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced, and this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security, and this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution, and this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments, and these investments create jobs and income, and so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behavior can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The phantom limb. Paradox: why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there, and these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations, and sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort, and this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it, and the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring, and yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations. is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand, stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers, and this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events, and this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury, and understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed, and the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs but applies to any body part, and body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless, and the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The problem of the many. A cloud drifts across the sky, its edges soft and undefined, fading gradually into the surrounding air, and a question arises that seems absurd at first. How many clouds are there? Is it one cloud, or is it many? And the answer is not as obvious as it seems, because the boundary of a cloud is vague, imprecise, and this vagueness creates a puzzle known as the problem of the many, a paradox about identity and indeterminacy that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a single object. Consider the cloud more carefully. There is no sharp line where the cloud ends and the clear air begins. Instead, there is a gradient of water droplet density, thicker in some regions and thinner in others. And so we could draw the boundary of the cloud in many slightly different ways, each including or excluding a few droplets at the edges. And each such boundary defines a distinct aggregate of water molecules, and each aggregate has an equal claim to being the cloud. None is more privileged than any other, and so instead of one cloud there are millions of overlapping cloud candidates, each differing by just a few molecules, and all of them present at the same time in the same region of space. The problem generalizes to nearly every ordinary object. A cat sitting on a mat consists of trillions of cells and molecules, and the boundary of the cat is not precise. A few skin cells flake off constantly, a few hairs are loose, and so there are countless cat candidates, each differing slightly in which particles they include, and all of them have an equal claim to being the cat. And yet we do not say there are millions of cats sitting on the mat. We say there is one cat, and this creates a tension between our linguistic and conceptual practices and the metaphysical reality that seems to support vast multiplicity where we perceive unity. The paradox was articulated clearly by Peter Unger in the 1980s, though the underlying issue has roots in ancient philosophy, and it forces a choice between several unappealing options. One option is to accept that there really are many overlapping objects where we ordinarily think there is one. Millions of clouds and cats and tables all occupying nearly the same space, differing only by a few particles at the margins. Another option is to deny that ordinary objects exist at all, arguing that only fundamental particles or fields are real, and that clouds and cats are mere conventional designations we impose on complex arrangements of matter. And a third option is to embrace vagueness in the world itself, arguing that there is no fact of the matter about exactly which particles compose the cat, that the cat is a vague object with indeterminate boundaries. Though this raises difficult questions about the metaphysics of vagueness and whether reality itself can be indeterminate, or whether indeterminacy exists only in language and thought. Some philosophers argue that identity is conventional. That which aggregates counts as the cloud or the cat is determined by our practical interests and linguistic conventions rather than by objective facts. That there is no deep truth about where the cloud ends, only a question of what it is useful or natural to call a cloud in various contexts. And this view dissolves the paradox by denying that there is a genuine metaphysical problem, replacing it with a pragmatic question about how we choose to describe the world. Others insist that the problem of the many reveals a real difficulty in our ontology, that the world does not come pre-divided into discrete objects, that individuation is imposed by minds rather than discovered in nature, and that the apparent distinctness and unity of ordinary things is an artifact of perception and cognition rather than a feature of reality itself. The problem also connects to issues in vagueness and the Saurit's paradox, because if the boundaries of objects are vague, then questions like how many clouds are in the sky or how many hairs must a person lose to become bald have no determinate answers. And this suggests that much of our language is infected with indeterminacy, that most predicates do not have sharp extensions, and that the classical logical principle of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false, may fail for a vast range of ordinary claims. The problem of the many lingers as a reminder that the world of discrete objects we navigate daily, a world of cats and clouds and people, may be a useful fiction, a conceptual overlay we impose on a reality that is far more fluid and indeterminate than it appears, and that the question of how many things there are may have no answer, or infinitely many answers, or no meaning at all depending on how we choose to carve up the continuous flux of matter and energy into countable, nameable entities. The predestination paradox. Time folds back on itself in strange ways, and among the strangest is the predestination paradox, a loop where an event in the past is caused by an event in the future, which is in turn caused by the past event, creating a circle of causation with no clear beginning. And yet, unlike other time travel paradoxes, this one involves no contradiction, only an unsettling sense that something is wrong with the very fabric of cause and effect. Imagine a historian who discovers an ancient artifact in a museum, a device whose origins are mysterious and unknown, and the historian becomes obsessed with understanding where it came from. And after years of research, they finally build a time machine and travel back to the era when the artifact should have been created. But upon arriving, they find no trace of it. No one has ever seen or heard of such a device. And in frustration, the historian accidentally leaves their own artifact behind in the past, where it is eventually discovered and placed in a museum, the very museum where the historian first found it centuries later. The artifact has no origin. It was never created. It simply exists in a loop, passed from future to past and back again, and the timeline is perfectly consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no contradiction, no paradox in the classical sense, and yet the mind recoils because it seems that something must have created the artifact, that objects do not simply exist without being made. The predestination paradox is closely related to the bootstrap paradox, but it emphasizes a different aspect of the problem, the idea that events can be predetermined by time travel, that the past is fixed not because of physical laws, but because travelers from the future have already shaped it, and any attempt to change history is doomed to fail because the changes have already happened. they are already part of the timeline. Consider a time traveler who learns of a great disaster and travels back to prevent it. But every action they take to stop the disaster instead contributes to causing it. Their warnings are misunderstood, their interventions backfire, and in the end, the disaster occurs exactly as history recorded. Because the time traveler was always part of that history. Their presence was always woven into the events, and there was never any other possible outcome. This raises profound questions about free will and determinism, because if time travel is possible, and the timeline is self-consistent, then perhaps the future is already written, every choice already made, every action already determined, and the feeling of free will is an illusion, a sensation that accompanies actions that were always going to happen, that could never have happened any other way. Some physicists embrace this view, arguing that the universe is a block where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and that time travel simply reveals what was always true, that history is immutable, that the timeline is a fixed structure, and we are merely moving through it, experiencing events in sequence, but unable to alter them. Others find this vision disturbing, a denial of agency, a suggestion that nothing we do matters, because it has all already been decided, and they seek alternatives. Perhaps in the many worlds interpretation, where every time travel event creates a new branch, or in models where time is more fluid and the past can genuinely be changed, though such models often struggle to avoid contradictions. The predestination paradox also appears in ancient mythology and philosophy, in the story of Oedipus, who tries to escape a prophecy but instead fulfills it through his very attempts to avoid it, in the idea of fate and destiny that pervades many cultures, the sense that some events are meant to be, that the future shapes the past as much as the past shapes the future. The paradox lingers as a reminder that time is stranger than it appears, that causation may not be as simple as earlier leading to later, that loops and circles might be woven into the structure of reality, and that the question of whether the future is open or closed, whether we are free or determined, may be inseparable from the question of whether time travel is possible, and if so, what kind of time travel the universe permits. The repugnant conclusion, why creating billions of barely happy people seems better. A utilitarian philosopher sits with a calculator, attempting to determine which world is best, which future humanity should aim for, and the principle guiding the calculation is simple. Maximize total happiness, create the most good, ensure that the sum of well-being across all people is as large as possible. And this seems like a reasonable goal, seems like an obviously good principle. Who could argue against making the world contain more happiness rather than less? And yet when this principle is applied consistently, when the logic is followed to its conclusion, the result is deeply counterintuitive, deeply troubling. And this troubling result is called the repugnant conclusion, first articulated by philosopher Derek Parfit. And it says that for any world containing a population of people living excellent lives, lives of great happiness and fulfillment, there exists a better world, according to utilitarian calculation, containing a much larger population, living lives barely worth living, lives that contain only slightly more happiness than suffering. And the second world is better, because even though each person is much less happy, the total amount of happiness is greater due to the vastly larger population. And this conclusion seems repugnant, seems to violate our intuitions about what makes a world good, and yet it follows logically from the principle of maximizing total happiness. Imagine World A, containing 1 billion people, and each person lives a wonderful life, a life filled with love, and beauty, and meaning, and joy, a life worth living many times over. And the total happiness in this world is enormous. And now imagine World Z, containing 1 trillion people, and each person's life is barely worth living, contains just slightly more pleasure than pain, just enough satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence, but not much more. No deep relationships, no profound experiences. Just a thin layer of positive feeling spread across a vast multitude. And when we calculate total happiness, World Z wins, because even though each person is much less happy, there are so many more people that the total sum is greater. 1 trillion barely positive lives sum to more total happiness than 1 billion excellent lives. And according to the utilitarian principle that says we should maximize total happiness, World Z is better than World A. We should prefer it, should work to bring it about. And this seems absurd, seems like a reduction to absurdity of the maximizing principle, and yet the logic is impeccable, follows directly from the idea that goodness is total happiness. Visualize the choice as a graph. On one axis is population size, on the other axis is average happiness per person, and World A has high average happiness and moderate population, and World Z has very low average happiness but enormous population, and the area under the curve represents total happiness, and World Z has more area, more total happiness, despite having much lower average happiness. And the repugnant conclusion says we should prefer the world with more area, more total happiness, even though this means accepting a vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living. And this seems to violate basic intuitions about human dignity, about quality of life, about what it means to create a good world. Because most people would rather live in World A, would rather be one of the 1 billion living excellent lives than one of the 1 trillion living barely positive lives. And a theory that says World Z is better seems to have gone wrong somewhere. Parfit called the conclusion repugnant because it seems to endorse a world that intuitively seems worse, seems to recommend creating vast populations, living lives of minimal quality, and this conflicts with our sense that what matters is not just total happiness, but how that happiness is distributed, how good each person's life is, whether lives are worth living in a robust sense, rather than barely scraping by. And the paradox forces a choice, either accept the repugnant conclusion and bite the bullet, admitting that yes, World Z really is better, and our intuitions are wrong, or reject total utilitarianism, reject the principle that all that matters is total happiness, and adopt some alternative that avoids the conclusion. But every alternative has costs, has its own counterintuitive implications. One response is to adopt average utilitarianism, which says what matters is not total happiness, but average happiness per person. And by this measure, World A is clearly better than World Z, because the average person in World A is much happier, and the repugnant conclusion is avoided. But average utilitarianism has its own problems. It implies that we can improve the world by killing unhappy people, because removing people whose happiness is below average raises the average. And this seems even more repugnant than the original conclusion. An average utilitarianism also implies that a world with one extremely happy person is better than a world with 1 billion moderately happy people, as long as the single person's happiness exceeds the average of the billion. And this seems wrong, seems to sacrifice too much for the sake of avoiding one counterintuitive conclusion. Another response is to adopt variable value principles, where the marginal value of adding a person depends on the quality of their life. Creating people with excellent lives adds more value per person than creating people with barely positive lives. And this can avoid the repugnant conclusion by making World A better than World Z, despite having fewer people, because the excellent lives contribute more value per person. But this approach requires specifying how the marginal value changes, requires drawing lines about which lives add how much value. And these lines seem arbitrary, and the approach faces technical difficulties, can generate cycles where A is better than B is better than C, and C is better than A, creating intransitive preferences that undermine rational choice. A third response is to reject consequentialism entirely, to argue that what matters is not just outcomes, not just how much happiness exists, but also rights, dignity, fairness. And these values are not captured by summing happiness and creating a world of 1 trillion people. Living barely worthwhile lives might maximize total happiness, but violates something important about human dignity, about what it means to respect persons. And this deontological response avoids the repugnant conclusion by appealing to values beyond happiness. But it must explain what these values are, how they are weighed against happiness, and whether they really should override considerations of total welfare. The repugnant conclusion also raises practical questions about population ethics, about how many people should exist, about whether we have obligations to create future people, and if so, what quality of life they should have. And these questions are not academic. They affect policy decisions about climate change, resource allocation, family planning, and sustainability. Because if creating more people is good, as long as their lives are worth living, then we should maximize population growth up to the point where additional people would lower everyone's quality of life below the barely worth living threshold. And this seems to recommend creating enormous populations living in poverty, which seems wrong. And if instead we think population should be limited to ensure high quality of life for each person, then we are rejecting total utilitarianism in favor of some other principle. And we need to say what that principle is and why it is right. Parfit himself was troubled by the repugnant conclusion, spent decades trying to find a population ethic that avoided it while remaining plausible, and he proposed various principles, but none fully satisfied him. And he concluded that population ethics is one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy, a domain where all theories seem to have deeply counterintuitive implications, and perhaps there is no fully satisfactory answer, no principle that aligns with all our intuitions, and we must choose which intuitions to preserve and which to sacrifice. And this choosing is itself a moral judgment, requires deciding what values are most important, and different people will make different choices based on different weights. They give to total happiness versus average happiness versus rights versus dignity. The calculator sits on the desk. The numbers are clear. World Z has more total happiness than World A. The calculation is not in doubt. And yet something rebels, something in us rejects the conclusion, insists that World A is better, that a world of 1 billion excellent lives is preferable to a world of 1 trillion barely positive lives, even if the total sum of happiness is less. And this rebellion reveals that our values are more complex than simple maximization, that we care about distribution, about quality, about more than just the sum, and the repugnant conclusion stands as a challenge to utilitarianism, as a reductio ad absurdum that forces reconsideration of the maximizing principle. And Parfit's legacy includes this unsolved problem, this paradox that shows the difficulty of systematizing our moral intuitions, the challenge of finding principles that match our judgments, and the repugnant conclusion remains, repugnant and unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of consequentialist ethics. A reminder that maximizing happiness may not be as simple or as obviously right as it first appears.